The next morning, Willette received a message from the senior ward saying that Charles was still absent. Mr. Ward mentioned that Dr. Allen had telephoned him to say that Charles would remain at Pawtuxet for some time and that he must not be disturbed. This was necessary because Allen himself was suddenly called away for an indefinite period, leaving the researches in need of Charles's constant oversight. Charles sent his best wishes and regretted any bother his abrupt change of plans might have caused. In listening to the message, Mr. Ward heard Dr. Allen's voice for the first time. It seemed to excite some vague and elusive memory, which could not be actually placed, but which was disturbing to the point of fearfulness. Faced by these baffling and contradictory reports, Dr. Willette was frankly at a loss of what to do. The frantic earnestness of Charles's note was not to be denied, yet what could one think of its writer's immediate violation of his own expressed policy? Young Ward had written that his delvings had become blasphemous and menacing, that they and his bearded colleague must be extirpated at any cost, and that he himself would never return to their final scene. Yet, according to latest advices, he had forgotten all this, was back in the thick of the mystery. Common sense bade one leave the youth alone with this freakishness, yet some deeper instinct would not permit the impression of that frenzied letter to subside. Willette read it over and over again and could not make its essence sound as empty and insane as both its bombastic verbiage and its lack of fulfillment would seem to imply. Its terror was too profound and real, and, in conjunction with what the doctor already knew, evoked too vivid hints of monstrosities from beyond time and space to permit of any cynical explanation. There were nameless horrors abroad, and no matter how little one might be able to get at them, one ought to stand prepared for any sort of action at any time. For over a week, Dr. Willette pondered on the dilemma which seemed to thrust upon him, and became more and more inclined to pay Charles a call at the Pawtuxet bungalow. No friend of the youth had ever ventured to storm this forbidden retreat, and even his father knew of its interior only from such descriptions as he chose to give. But Willette felt that some direct conversation with his patient was necessary. Mr. Ward had been receiving brief and non-committal typed notes from his son, and said that Mrs. Ward in her Atlantic City retirement had no better word, so at length the doctor resolved to act. Despite a curious sensation inspired by old legends of Joseph Curwen and by more recent revelations and warnings from Charles Ward, set boldly out for the bungalow on the bluff above the river. Willette had visited the spot before through sheer curiosity, though, of course, never entering the house or proclaiming his presence. Hence, knew exactly the route to take, driving out by Broad Street one early afternoon, toward the end of February. In his small motor, he thought oddly of the grim party which had taken that self-same road 157 years before, on a terrible errand which none might ever comprehend. The ride through the city's decaying fringe was short and trim, and Edgewood and sleepy Pawtuxet presently spread out ahead. Willette turned to the right, down Lockwood Street, and drove his car as far along that rural road as he could, then alighted and walked north to where the bluff towards above the lovely bends of the river and the sweep of the misty downlands beyond. Houses were still few here, and there was no mistaking the isolated bungalow with its concrete garage on a high point on a high point of land at his left. Stepping briskly up the neglected gravel walk, he rapped at the door with a firm hand and spoke without a tremor to the evil Portuguese mulatto, who opened it to the width of a crack. Why was he evil? well, the experiments, But, he must, he said, see Charles Ward at once on vitally important business. No excuse would be accepted. At a repulse would mean only a full report of the matter to the elder Ward. The mulatto still hesitated, and pushed against the door when Willett attempted to open it, but the doctor merely raised his voice and renewed his demands. Then there came from the dark interior a husky whisper, which somehow chilled the hearer through and through, though he did not know why he feared it. "Let him in, Tony," it said. "We may as well talk now as ever." But disturbing as was the whisper, the greater fear was that which immediately followed. The floor creaked, and the speaker hove in sight, and the owner of these strange and resonant tones was seen to be no other than Charles Dexter Ward. The minuteness with which Dr. Willett recalled and recorded his conversation of that afternoon is due to the importance he assigns to this peculiar period, for at last he concedes a vital change in Charles Dexter Ward's mentality and believes that the youth now spoke from a brain hopelessly alien to the brain whose growth he had watched for 26 years. Controversy with Dr. Lyman has compelled him to be very specific, and he definitely dates the madness of Charles Ward from the time the typewritten notes began to reach his parents. These notes are not in Ward's normal style, not even in the style of that last frantic letter to Willett. Instead, they are strange and archaic, as if snapping of the writer's mind had released a flood of tendencies and impressions picked up unconsciously through the boyhood antiquarianism. There is an obvious effort to be modern, but the spirit and occasionally the language are those of the past. Now, people act like, basically after the onset of puberty and the following stages are all stages where we can change, and all stages which we're accountable unless we've gone totally insane. And perhaps we've done things to make ourselves insane that were wrong, and therefore we're responsible for those things, like the idea that, well, when he sobers up, yeah, you're responsible for what you do when you're drunk or high or whatever, but people can change after a particular point. But schizophrenia isn't like 25, 26 the peak of the onset of such things? It's also when average consumption of alcohol and stuff goes down. The past, too, was evident in Ward's every tone and gesture as he received the doctor in the shadowy bungalow, bowed, motioned Willett to a seat, and began to speak abruptly in that strange whisper which he sought to explain at the very outset. "I am grown physical," he began, "from this cursed river air. You must excuse my speech. I suppose you are come from my father to see what ails me, and I hope you will say nothing to alarm him." Willett was studying these scrapping tones with extreme care, but studying even more closely the face of the speaker. Something he felt was wrong, and he thought of what the family had told him about the fright of the Yorkshire butler one night. He wished it were not so dark, but did not request that any blind be opened. Instead, he merely asked Ward why he had so belied the frantic note of little more than a week before. "I was coming to that," the host replied. "You must know I am in a very bad state of nerves and do not say queer things I cannot account for. As I have told you often, I am on the edge of great matters, and the bigness of them has a way of making me light-headed. Any man might well be frightened of what I have found, but I am not to be put off for long. I was a dunce to have that guard and stick at home. For, having gone this far, my place is here. I am not well spoke of by my prying neighbors, and perhaps I was led by weakness to believe myself what they say of me. There is no evil to any in what I do, so long as I do it rightly. Have the goodness to wait 6 months, and I'll show you what will pay your patience well. You may as well know that I have a way of learning old matters from things surer than books, and I'll leave you to judge the importance of what I can give to history, philosophy, and the arts by reason of the doors I have access to. My ancestor had all this, when the witless, peeping Toms came and murdered him. I now have it again, or am coming very imperfectly to have a part of it. This time nothing must happen, and at least of all, through any idiot fears of my own, pray forget all I writ you, sir, and have no fear of this place, or any in it. Dr. Allen is a man of fine parts, and I owe him an apology for anything ill I have said of him. I wish I had no need to spare him, but there were things he had to do elsewhere. His zeal is equal to mine in all those matters, and I suppose that when I feared the work, I feared him, too, as my greatest helper in it. Huxley, The Doors of Perception. When was that written? Ward paused, and the doctor hardly knew what to say or think. He felt almost foolish in the face of this calm repudiation of the letter, and yet there clung to him the fact that while the present discourse was strange and alien and indubitably mad, the note itself had been tragic in its naturalness and likeness to the Charles Ward he knew. Willett now tried to turn the talk on early matters and recall to the youth some past events which would restore a familiar mood, but in this process he obtained only the most grotesque results. It was the same with all the alienists later on. Important sections of Charles Ward's store of mental images, mainly those touching modern times and his own personal life, had been unaccountably expunged, while all the massed antiquarianism of his youth had welled up for some profound subconscious to engulf the contemporary and the individual. The youth's ultimate knowledge of older things was abnormal and unholy. He tried his best to hide it when Willett would mention some favorite object of his boyhood, archaistic studies. He often shed, by pure accident, such a light as no normal mortal conceivably could be expected to possess. Well, just because it's not expected doesn't mean we're not capable of it. And the doctor shuddered as the glib allusion glided by. It was not wholesome to know so much about the way the fat sheriff's wig fell off as he leaned over at the play in Mr. Douglas's Histrionic Academy in King Street on the 11th of February, 1762, which fell on a Thursday, or about how the actors cut the text of the Steele's Conscious Lover so badly that one was almost glad the Baptist-ridden legislature closed the theater a fortnight later. That Thomas Sabin's Boston coach was damned uncomfortable. Old letters might well have told, but what healthy antiquarian could recall how the creaking of Epinetus Olney's new signboard, the gaudy crown he set up after he took to calling his tavern the Crown of the Coffee House, the Crown Coffee House, was exactly like the first few notes of the new jazz piece. All the radios in Pawtuxet were playing. Ward, however, would not be quizzed long in this vain, modern and personal topics. He waved aside quite summarily. Whilst regarding antique affairs, he soon showed the plainest boredom. What he wished, certainly enough, was only to satisfy his visitor enough to make him depart without the intention of returning. To this end, he offered to show Dr. Willett the entire house, but at once proceeded to lead the doctor through every room, from cellar to attic. Willett looked sharply, but noted that the visible books were far too few and trivial ever to have filled the wide gaps on Ward's shelves at home, and that the meager so-called laboratory was the flimsiest sort of a blind. Clearly, there were a library and a laboratory elsewhere, but just where it was impossible to say. Essentially defeated in his quest for something he could not name, Willett returned to town before evening and told the senior ward everything which had occurred. They agreed that the youth must be definitely out of his mind, but decided that nothing drastic need be done just yet. Above all, Mrs. Ward must be kept and as complete an ignorance as her son's own strange typed notes would permit. Mr. Ward now determined to call in person upon his son, making it wholly a surprise visit. Dr. Willett took him in his car one evening, guiding him to within sight of the bungalow. Getting rumbly in the tumbly. And waiting patiently for his return. The session was a long one, and the father emerged in a very saddened and perplexed state. His reception had developed much like Willett's, save that Charles had been an excessively long time in appearing after the visitor had forced his way into the hall and sent the Portuguese away. With an imperative demand, and in the bearing of the altered son there was no trace of filial affection. The lights had been dim, yet even so the youth had complained that they dazzled him outrageously. He had not spoken out loud at all, averring that his throat was in very poor condition, but in his hoarse whisper there was a quality so vaguely disturbing that Mr. Ward could not banish it from his mind. Squirrel, or chickmunk, was what I was trying to figure out what it was. Now definitely leagued together to do all they could toward the youth's mental salvation. Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett set about collecting every scrap of data which the case might afford. Pawtuxet gossip was the first item they studied, and this was relatively easy to glean since both had friends in that region. Dr. Willett obtained the most rumors because people talked more frankly to him than to a parent of the central figure, and from all he heard he could tell that the young Ward's life had become indeed a strange one. Common tongues would not disclose his household from the vampirism, would not dissociate his household from the vampirism of the previous summer, while the nocturnal comings and goings of the motor trucks provided their share of dark speculation. Local tradesmen spoke of the queerness of the orders brought them by the evil-looking mulatto, and in particular the inordinate amounts of meat and fresh blood secured from the 2 butcher shops in the immediate neighborhood.